We know that Zuckerberg is connecting more people than anybody else. We know that Bill Gates started a revolution that brought computers onto every person's desk long before people thought that was possible, when the computer was locked in a room somewhere and making a lot of noise. And then we know that Aliko Dangote here in Nigeria puts more people to work than anybody else. And if he gets that Apapa road paved, he'll help more work get to work than anybody else. So I think these are pretty good examples of two things. Number one, real success as an entrepreneur is when you connect people. When you figure out a way to deliver a good or a service for less than it is worth to the people you deliver it to. You know, I love the fact that in Nigeria, everybody that I've met has the heart of a businesswoman or man. Because if there's one thing that I've learned in your country over the last 2 years, it is that you're always thinking about value for money. What's it really worth? That's the heart of entrepreneurship. Creating things worth more than it cost you to create them, and then connecting people and filling a need. You know, when you mentioned Bezos, he did a wonderful interview on entrepreneurship the other day, in which he said, I have a lot of competitors, because basically he sells things and delivers them. But he said, I think that all my competitors spend a lot of time thinking about the competitors, and I spend all my time thinking about the customer. Again, connecting people. Zuckerberg. When I was in college, before Zuckerberg was born, probably, we had a book with pictures of every student when my sister was at Harvard. And we didn't call it Facebook. We called it something else. Kind of like your book, we actually called it Pig Book because the pictures in it often made us look very unattractive. And so it was a Harvard institution. My sister's picture, I thought, was a pretty nice picture. But it had the picture, it had where you were from, what your major was, what house you were in, what your interests were. Mark and his team took what everybody was doing and took it global. So what that story tells is that you don't just make money with a completely new idea. Sometimes, like a seed of an ancient grain, you make money taking a seed and planting it on new ground. Or maybe, like agriculture in Nigeria today, finding new ways to be more efficient as farmers and as livestock people. But now let's think about Bill Gates. Literally what Bill did was he brought the concept of the home computer home, which meant that he actually began the process that today on your phone connects you at every second, not just to every other corner of the world almost, but also to every idea, every image, every other person. And Bill began that with that wonderful egg-shaped or apple-inspired computer that I had on my desk a long time ago. And now let's talk about Aliko. This is an incredible country. But one of the reasons why it's incredible is that it's big in population and it's big in expanse. This is a country that cries out for infrastructure. It cries out literally and figuratively for ways to cement together, like Dangote cement, to cement together a nation that was an idea before it was a country. So, I think you're right. Those are remarkable entrepreneurs. But what do they teach you? I think they teach you three things. First, the idea. Second, the customer, the audience, the connection. But third, I think they need to teach you this. What is the true value of what I'm doing? What will come of it? Because I bet there are days when a man who builds a highway hears about an accident on the highway and asks himself, could I have built a better road? There are definitely days that terrible things happen on the computer, cyberbullying. There are days that people use social media not to bring people together to do good, but to drive people apart by doing harm. And then there are days when you get something from Amazon that you don't want and you have to send it back. It isn't the connection that ensures the quality. It's the conscience and the principle of the entrepreneur. You know, I know this is a morning to think about entrepreneurship, but I want you to know all across Nigeria yesterday, a bunch of people who I bet you don't think of as entrepreneurs launched campaigns. Those who are running for state office might have launched their campaigns a couple weeks early, especially in Lagos, but we won't mention any names, even if their signs did take all the best spots. But they're entrepreneurs. They're trying to connect themselves with you. And they're also entrepreneurs because they're trying to develop and market a product of value. Now, it's interesting that if they think that the product of value is they themselves, if they think the candidate is the cause, then they miss an opportunity. If you think, as an entrepreneur, that it's all about you and how many customers you have or how much money you've made, what your stock is worth, I think you've also got it wrong. It's really about whether or not, in the case of a candidate for office, whether that candidate will be able to connect with all of you to create greater value for all of us. And for a business, it's the same thing. So, what does Nigeria really need? Where do we really need entrepreneurs in Nigeria? Simple answer is everywhere. Good news is there are entrepreneurs everywhere. I had an interesting discussion when I was in California this summer with a person, and I said, you know, I think that small farmers are the most entrepreneurial people in the whole world, because every year they decide when they're going to plant with an eye to the sky and a prayer to God that they've got it right. Then they decide what products they're going to plant with an eye to the market and an eye to their neighbors and the hope that maybe they'll get the product right. Then they go ahead and plant, and they spend the whole year in the Niger Valley and the Benue Valley watching the storm clouds roll in and wondering whether or not there's going to be too much rain, like this year, or too little. So I told a really very successful big business entrepreneur that I thought I was living in a country with more entrepreneurs than we had in the United States, and he was not amused. He was a Silicon Valley guy. He said, oh, Symington, you don't understand what entrepreneurship is. So maybe I don't, and I hope that there will be other people who will teach you better than I can teach you about making money. Because I'm a little bit like a guy who looks at a beautiful image of art and says, what a beautiful image of art. When it comes to making money, don't take advice from me. Because I'm one of those guys who's chosen in his life to help spend the money that you and others have made. My argument is I'm spending it for a good cause. It's up to you to decide that. But let me come around to this last point and hit it again. Citizens in a democracy have to be entrepreneurs. And every entrepreneur has to truly be a citizen, thinking not just of themselves, but of others. And here are, for those of you who believe what I just said to be true, here are a couple of challenges for you. And it'll be interesting to see how you capture them, because I found in life I should do what I never do, and that is get a whiteboard and write out the idea so that it doesn't create 100 different ideas in 100 different listeners' ears. I think it's more fun to create 100 different ideas, and may the best idea win. So here's the first idea. Number one, think of your country and your customer before your company and yourself. And make that clear at all times, so that people love to work with you. Number two, Nigeria is not a box. Edo State, Kebbi, Ebonyi, Jigawa, these aren't boxes. These are living cells. People move in and out across the membrane, across the border all the time. Nigeria is not a box. So number two, think outside the box. Don't define your market like some shoe that is too small that you will soon outgrow. You're Nigerians. Think about the whole world. And above all, think about all of West Africa. Number three, ask yourself every day two questions. Today, am I creating something of value that is worth more than it costs me to create? And at the very same time, ask yourself, is what I am creating good? In short, am I doing well today? And am I doing good today? Any day that you just do good and don't do well, you are not an entrepreneur. Any day that you just do well and you do not do good, you're not an entrepreneur. You've got to do both. You can only sustain doing good in life if you are able to make money and do well. Or somebody else is able to make money and do well and support your good. The cool thing about being an entrepreneur is you can do it both. You can do good and do well at the same time. You can marry these two pieces of conscience and interest that is present in every great country, in every functioning democracy. So once again, entrepreneurs every day find a way to create something worth more than it costs you to make. That means you will do well. And then make sure that the product that you make is good. That will ensure that you succeed as an entrepreneur, as a company, as a citizen, as a country. Now, I ask you now to think with me just briefly about three specific challenges, because I would love the women and men in this room to disrupt this group of three right now. Challenge number one, public education, basic literacy and numeracy in Nigeria. All of you have probably heard that there are between 10 and 13 million people who have never gone to school. I'll leave it to you to guess how many people went to school but don't really know how to read and don't really know how to use numbers. I'm one of them. I can read pretty well, but don't ask me to multiply in my head. So, number one, how can you figure out a way to use all of those relationships that Zuckerberg and Gates and Bezos and so many other people have come up with for delivering ideas, and then the roads and the institutions that Alico has helped to build? with lots of Nigerians, how can you figure out a way to disrupt, which is to say, accelerate in some new way the education of Nigerians? But I'd add one kicker, because you're entrepreneurs and you didn't stand up when I came in the room. Figure out a way to make money doing this, and you will figure out a way to solve the problem. The minute something goes from being a money suck to a money pump in our world, the problem gets solved. So the great disruption is to figure out how to make education somehow, once again as it was when the oldest among you were young, a no-kidding lucrative profession, a respected and lucrative profession. And my only hint as you try to disrupt this problem is, don't try to disrupt it the way most of those people running for office are trying to disrupt it, by saying the government should pay for it and it should be free. Because ask yourself, how many things in life is it possible to get for free again and again and again and again? So that's number one, education. Here's number two. I know a lot of people are working on it. It's connectivity. Somebody in this room ought to do a map of broadband connections around Nigeria, in your hometown, in your home state, around the country. Somebody ought to come up with what we came up with in the United States in the 1930s and 40s, looking at what they were doing in Germany with the Autobahn, and that was the National Interstate Highway Act. It was to the development of other countries is to be a global leader in connectivity. Exactly the thoughts that we started with. Bezos, imagine Bezos, Zuckerberg, and Gates with no connectivity. It would be Jeff, Mark, and what's your name again? Bill? The world wouldn't know. So that's the second one. Here's the third one. It's another touch on education, but it's with it's at the opposite end. Here's the single greatest challenge for most entrepreneurs and young people and old starting a business is probably, the number one thing is probably mentoring. It's probably people who actually have made all the mistakes in the books saying, you can do it that way. There's an old story in Maine about an old guy sitting on his porch, and a young kid from Boston walks by and says, am I going? No, I think he says, if I keep going this way, can I get to Boston? And the old man says, yeah. And the young man says, well, thanks. And he starts walking off, and the old man says, but if you turn around, you'll get there in about 100 miles. If you keep going that way, it'll be about 24,000. There's an awful lot to be said for having someone point you in the right direction, with or without a joke. And so there is an opportunity to disrupt mentoring in Nigeria, because vocational technical school and university, and then the kind of teamwork that follows that, the incubators, these are all a form of mentoring. I'm sure there are some private vocational technical schools in Nigeria that teach people to be incredibly competent electricians. But after this meeting, I want someone to come and tell me where they are, because I want to hire one of those guys to keep working on my house. There are an extraordinary number of skilled professions in this country where there's a huge opportunity to disrupt by bringing up the level of skill to the world class. It's kind of like bringing up the level of the polity. And people all over the world, in Europe, in the United States, and other places, make a business. They do well. They make money, helping connect people with their future in this way. So I urge you to think about disrupting mentoring in the skilled trades, vocational technical education, where companies and end users define strong needs and then go to the institution and say, if you teach your students this, and if you send them to us as interns or something, and if they have good work ethic and they don't misbehave, we will put them to work, or they might go to work themselves. So that's another extraordinary one. And then I'll give you just one more, and this is about the nation as a whole. This is the hardest one of all. Even daylight is not free. Even daylight is not free. Talk to some fellow who lives at the North Pole in the winter. Or talk to any of us when the sun goes down. Much of the life of mankind has been literally and figuratively bringing light when the sun is not out. First with fire, and then eventually with batteries that help to capture solar power. Nothing in life, except maybe the love of your family, until you exhaust that by being an obnoxious young fellow. Nothing is free. So why is it that we think somehow that freedom, free people, democracies with freely elected leaders, free enterprise, why is it that we think, we use that word free, but I think actually many people, including many in Nigeria, somehow believe it should be. That we should be a little bit like one of those marvelous pictures that I've seen and then walked into in the greatest forest on the African continent, the Cross River National Park forest. We should be in the Garden of Eden. The fruit should fall in our hand. The trees should arch over us and provide us. The animals should make the path, and we can follow the path. The water flowing down the timber-covered mountain, clear at our hand. The fish almost leaping into our nets. All that, by the way, in Nigeria is called oil and gas revenue. So here's the last thing I ask you to disrupt, and it's by far the hardest of all. I want you to think about how you can do well and do good for your country, your company, and yourselves by taking a very hard look at a question that I cannot answer myself. And that is, how should Nigerians pay for Nigeria? Because today, the answer is, Nigerians are not paying the true cost of good governance, or even of governance itself. If you look at how much revenue comes from oil and goes to government, even if there was no corruption in the world or in this country, if you look at the raw numbers and you compare it to Nigeria's total economy, your gross domestic product, the revenue from oil in 2017 was something like 2.5% of your GDP. Now, I know many of you are saying, I don't know about everybody else, but I pay an awful lot of taxes. Well, I've talked to a lot of businesswomen and men here, and I said, if you pay so many taxes here and you have so many hassles here, why don't you go back to the other country where you're a citizen, which in this one woman's case was England, and work there? And she looked at me like I was an idiot. And she said, are you kidding? I can do much better here, even though my blood pressure goes up. So here's the challenge. The challenge is to do much better here while your nation is doing much better. And that's where you get to this last disruption. So oil and gas revenue in 2017 was roughly 2.5% of GDP for all of government. I'm not talking the budget, I'm talking the revenue. Other revenue that year amounted to, I was told, something like 3.5% of GDP. So the total of oil and gas revenue, 2.5%, other revenue, 3.5%, which surprised me, but that includes all the internally generated revenue in Lagos and every place else. That came up to 6% of GDP. In the United States, the comparable figure is 24.5%. In the 20 biggest countries in the world, it's 30%, 20 biggest economies. And in the 7 biggest economies of all, it's 40%. Now, I know Nigeria hustles. I know Nigeria is smart. I know Nigeria is incredibly strong, incredibly diverse, and wonderful. But I don't think you can get as far as you want to go with 6 units when everybody else who has gotten where you seek to go is spending 24 or 30 or 35 or 40. So talk about a challenge for business. If over the course of the next few years, all of you succeed as individuals and companies in filling the needs of your clients, but your country doesn't succeed, and the region doesn't succeed in fulfilling its entrepreneurial and corporate responsibility of providing justice and security and transportation opportunities and everything, what will that profit you? Where will you be? Where will Nigeria be? So here's the last and the greatest challenge. If you are at 6 and you need to go up, the question then is, how do you go up without visiting people out of work when what you want to do is bring them in? And that gets back to that wonderful Nigerian concept of value for money, which is the heart of all entrepreneurial success. You've got to figure out a way, and I don't know the answer, but you've got to figure out a way to first recognize that government needs to be supported every day by citizens the way companies need to be supported every day by not only employees, but customers. Because you are both a shareholder and a customer of governance. So the question is, how can you figure this out? The only thing I would urge you to remember from this question, this last of these areas to disrupt, starting with basic education and going all the way to this. The thing I want you to remember is this. There is no such thing as good governance for free. And if there will be good governance for all of you, then the question is, how will you pay for it? And how will you do it together? My own simplistic idea as a start for you is that there's a big conversation about restructuring. I used to think that conversation was just code for give me all the money coming from an oil-producing state. I now realize it's slightly more complex because of exclusive authorities and non-exclusive authorities and shared authorities in the Constitution. So there's a lively debate ahead. But you know, that debate isn't about the fundamental question I just asked. That debate is about who's in charge. It's not about what's the solution. As an entrepreneur, I hope you will never conclude that because you've got the name and the product, you're in charge. It's your market. The only way you maintain a market is by the value of what it is that you make or what service you produce. Brand alone won't do it. It's the same is true for government. So on the conversation of restructuring, I urge people to think of that only as a path to a better, more precise question, which is, what do we have to do together, all of us, to once again restore security. What do we have to do together, all of us, to improve transportation, etc.? And then one gets into the question of whether you do toll roads, fee for service, all those sorts of things. What do we have to do to get a better grip on rural livestock issues? Well, you know, there was a time when the answer to that question was everybody paid a fee and everybody got a service. So I don't think, quite often, as you think about disrupting, once again, you will think that you need to come up with a completely new idea. I think the reason we have books and grandmothers is to remind us that every good idea doesn't have to be new, and every one of us doesn't have to make the same mistakes that she or her husband did. So guys, congratulations on being in what I think is the most important conversation in one of the very most important countries on the face of the earth. Thank you all.